This hangout is live. This is the Oneness Talking Point, episode 14, relationships. It's a scary proposition, really. I think talking about them more than having them, there's a setting in stone fear that happens when people start talking about relationships. I have this running monologue about the reification of relationships, which is that idea, excuse me, that we walk around not pretending, we walk around assuming that relationships are this thing that exist in and of themselves, and we feed them, the relationship with my husband or my wife or my girlfriend or whatever. And we have all these stories about this thing that exists separately in the universe, separately from the actual interactions that are going on, the actual words coming out of your mouth and their mouth, the actual thoughts going on in their presence. And this thing, this separate sphere, this reification of a relationship becomes an entity in our existence, in our experience. And we monitor its health and we justify its existence and we feed it positive energy, or we dedicate a certain amount of time to it, rather than the actualness, the experience of what we have labeled a relationship. So the actualness is the being in the room with that person, regardless of the sphere of knowledge and assumptions about what that relationship means. It's tempting, I think, because we kind of invest in its health as a thing that started at a certain point, that needs a certain amount of our energy and attention, and that will only exist if we do what we do as if it is a sphere, a thing separate that exists as an entity. But just, imagine or experiment for one day what it would mean to have a relationship that didn't have or need the entity to exist. So when you walk into that room or touch that person or have a conversation or think about them, allowing all of those things to be present with you in this moment, rather than attached to a story about what a relationship is that carries through time. This boulder or baggage or balloon of evidence, sphere of influence, morphic field that you carry from one place to another, from one day to the next. What if you could be present to the interaction that's occurring? What if you could be present to yourself and the person you're with at that moment? And so the whole concept of relationship changes. And I'm not asking you to do that. I'm not even suggesting that that's something that would make your life better. I'm just talking about the sense that in oneness, a concept of a relationship is moot, really. I mean, you understand that you have a husband, or either you have a child or a brother or whatever, but the concept of the reification of that relationship existing as a thing in and of itself that you can measure and monitor its health doesn't really work. It's unnecessary. If you're constantly present to what's going on, there's no separation between the people that are in your life and the tuning to this moment as an equal and essential aspect of all that is, or however that makes sense to you. So even though you recognize there are people that happen to be there on a more consistent basis than others, and there are things that they remember that you've done together and all of that stuff, you also recognize that stuff is only relevant to the now of this moment in your interaction with them, or you're thinking about them, or you're feeling. So even if you have what we call a history with somebody, the relevance, the bits and pieces that are relevant from that history in this moment will change in every moment. The things that we pick and choose to be moved by in this moment, I mean, that's why relationships end and start. There's and rekindle and end again, and there's something to be discovered about ourselves and being present to this moment without that reification, or with a consciousness of that reification being necessary in your cosmology. And that discovery is the question of self-acceptance. Self-awareness is one thing, seeing all the cards on the table, the kind of interactions you're having, the kind of so-called reactions you're experiencing, the kind of desires, feelings and thoughts, emotions, doubts, fears, whatever you want to call those things, the now experiences that you're having. Tell us something about ourselves when we can see them all on the table without kind of turning those cards over and having stories about why they're there, or attempting to justify them, or attempting to make them evidence for what needs to change, or how we're messed up because of XYZ. Just being able to have those cards on the table is self-awareness. And then, the question of self-acceptance, because I don't think it's a natural step, and I don't think it needs to be. I think it will be a natural step if it needs to be, and it won't be a natural step if it doesn't need to be, if something else needs to occur. And having all those cards on the table is a beautiful thing. And the question of self-acceptance is, are all of those things equally valuable? And if the answer is no, if you judge something as, like, say you're impatient with a certain person under certain circumstances at a certain time, and that needs to change in order for you to have self-acceptance, then that card that you have, that self-awareness that you've labeled impatience, which somebody else could label something else, the question of self-acceptance around that is no, I'm not going to accept that as an equal and essential aspect of who I am. I'm going to make that evidence for what I could be if I could fix, change, or heal this aspect of myself. And then the self-awareness, again, that's another point of self-awareness. And then the question of self-acceptance: can I accept that I am the person who has a characteristic which is the impetus for a desire to change who I am? I am not 100% acceptable at this point in time. I cannot love and appreciate and acknowledge everything that I am as necessary or divine, or whatever language makes sense to you. And I guess that's part of the conversation about relationships, because the relationship that you have with your identity, with your worth, with your ability to make noise and take up space, is what I call it, with your comfort and awareness and desire to be who you are. That's also a relationship. And you can reify that relationship, as in you can make that another morphic field or another separate sphere with a story about the health of your relationship with yourself. And you can monitor and measure the health of the relationship with yourself, and you can check in with it and feed it positive energy and, create this whole awareness around it. Or in oneness, you can have that sense of understanding that the concept of relationship and the concept of self are just experiences in the fluid oneness of all that is. Like the whirlpool that appears in the ocean. They might look like they have form, and they might look like they have a boundary, and they might look like they're consistent over time. But when you appreciate that a whirlpool is actually constantly moving drops of an ocean, and it's never actually separate from that ocean, then you're allowed to have those experiences that seem like self or seem like relationship with self without actually attaching yourself to that definition of what's going on. So you're attached to the definition of oneness, that whirlpool in the ocean, while allowing yourself to have the experience that seems like a relationship with self or a relationship with others, without necessarily needing to reify it, without needing to make it a thing that a third entity in the room or a second entity in the room that you need to mollify. But it's up to you, and I guess that's the point of these conversations. Again, what does it mean to you? What do relationships mean to you? Do you have a schedule of characteristics of a healthy relationship? Do you have a story about your string of unhealthy relationships? Do you have a story about your tendency to look after your relationships with other people but not with yourself? Let this be a process of self-awareness, if nothing else. Put all those cards on the table and figure out what it is that's true for you, that makes sense, that when you look at it, you go, that's it, that's how the world works. And then if those cards flip and start to give you explanations for, that's all right, just go with that and write down those explanations and see what happens when you follow that thread of self-awareness. And just keep bringing yourself back to the point, the reality that this is a process of self-awareness, and all of the things that are coming into your awareness are relevant to this conversation, to this process. So rather than making it a tangent and saying, well, that's got nothing to do with what I'm looking at, just accept without evidence that somehow it's relevant to what's going on. Even if it's a feeling and it's not something that you need to write down, or it's a desire to listen to a certain song, or, you know, it's time to eat lunch, or, you know, allow it to be a process of self-awareness without evidence, just for a little while. You know, you can have 3 minutes, 30 minutes, 3 days, whatever you feel inspired, however you feel inspired to explore it. And then in the conclusion, I mean, it never actually ends, our self-awareness, but, you know, if you find a point that you feel comfortable kind of squeezing it off and going, okay, I'd like to ask the question of self-acceptance. Sometimes that's not an easy point to identify, and I think for a lot of people it's difficult to do on their own. They find it more, it's not that it's easier, it's just that they don't have to play two roles. So if you've got someone who can be with you while you're, sorry, hit the microphone, while you're asking the self-acceptance question, you can have your experience, and that person can be there to constantly bring you back to what it is that's going on. So not by telling you, but by asking you questions and kind of giving some scope to the experience. So you're free to cry and, you know, have a story tangent, and you know that there's someone there who's accepting it all as relevant. They're never going to turn around and chop off part of your story and say, where the hell are you going with that, lady? You know, they're going to stay with you in the story or the experience that you're having, and house that experience, as in HOUSE, house that experience as part of your question of self-acceptance, as in, do I, can I, am I able to accept all of these aspects in my self-awareness as equally valuable, worthwhile, part of my perfection, divinity, wholeness. And it may not be a yes or no answer. There may just be a whole lot of self-awareness that comes up in that question, which is perfect. You know, if all the process does is allow you to see all the cards of who you are and how you operate, that's a beautiful thing. That's a worthwhile university course worth of material to explore. I think there's, say it's underrated, but I think it's almost become a chore to answer the questions about who am I and why am I here. And I can understand the weariness with that approach. I can understand I'm just trying to think of the word. All I can see is the person going, oh, that. Right? I can understand that when someone says, we have to start here again. Because they're very loaded questions that you often get in those processes. I think, you know, one of the things about Heart Alchemy and Oneness and all the work that I do is there's no end of the sentence, and I'm constantly handing back what's relevant to you. So when I say there's no end of the sentence, I mean if you believe blah, 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 then you're XYZ. Okay, there's no then you're XYZ in my questions, in my statements, in the processes that you do with me in oneness. There's just the first part of the question and often a reflection at the end of the sentence, which is an exact mirror image of the beginning of the sentence. So if you're blah, 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 then you're blah, blah, blah. And because it's not loaded and no conclusion has been come to and no problem has been identified, no issue has been bounded, you're left with the awareness, the facts that you've come up with. So you decide if you're blah, blah, blah. That came from you. That didn't come from me. If you're blah, 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 then you're blah, blah, blah. And I hand that back to you. And you rage and spit fire and say, but that's not an answer and it doesn't tell me anything. And you know, that idea that the truth is the truth and there are no consequences in that kind of duality exchange proposition of how the world works, which is very relevant to relationships. You know, that idea of a healthy reification. If the person I'm with, I don't know, whatever the things are that you can't abide or the things that are absolutely necessary, they don't take into account the context. They're not a present-centered proposition. They're a duality, exchange, separation way of being in the world. And if that's what you're doing, then that's what you're doing. That's the handing back. It's not loading it as a good or a bad thing. It's not diagnosing it as a means to an end, a problem to solve, an issue to resolve. You know, there's no sense that the quality and worthiness of that experience, that reality of what's going on for you is any less sacred than anybody else's reality experience. So if you have a list of requirements and boxes to tick in order to know that a relationship is healthy, then that's what you have. Is that acceptable to you? I mean, there's no judgment being laid on top, you know, and I think relationships are probably a really enlightening, illuminating place to begin in that self-awareness, self-acceptance process. It can be intense for some people to, you know, look at the truth of who they are without judgment. But you only look at the truth of who you are without judgment until you keep asking the question, you know, is that acceptable? The self-acceptance question. And then you say, no, I need to judge it. And you go, right, okay, well, that's what you need to do. So judge it. And then that becomes part of the truth. But you don't know that's really part of the truth until you begin with that non-judgmental self-awareness that only sees what is going on and not all the stories about it, just to begin with. All the stories are still relevant. You're not going to get rid of them. You're not transforming them into anything. You're not removing the judgment of self. You're allowing the awareness to be what it is. And I mean, I guess for most people, the awareness forces those cards to flip and all those stories become emergent. And in the emergence of those stories is the truth of who you are. And so then you say, come back to the question of self-acceptance, you know, are all those stories and all those aspects equally sacred? And if they're not, they're not. And you figure out what your hierarchy is. And it's the same with relationships. And I think even if you do have a hierarchy and you do have judgment and you do have, standards and boxes and things that you'll never forgive and the separate sphere of influence, the morphic field and reification of that relationship, I think having that self-awareness and then asking, seeing the emergent stories and asking that self-acceptance question allows you to have all those things and know what they are. There's something about knowing that, I don't know, like the argument that you're having is actually about the reification of a relationship, which you've accepted is necessary, is part of the sacredness of who you are, or that the end of a relationship is about the hierarchy of characteristics or behaviors that are necessary to the sacredness of who you are. Once you get a better sense that all of the things that are occurring that you would normally think of as bad, like arguments and the ends of relationships and feeling betrayed and wanting more and feeling neglected, and once you understand that those experiences are part of the sacredness that you have accepted through an awareness of who you are, then you can have that experience in a new way. So you'll still end the relationship and you'll still have the standards, but there's something about, it's not knowing the reason. I don't know how else to say it. There's something about accepting the sacredness of what's going on, of knowing that it didn't just come from nowhere, of knowing that it's part of a personal order of truth. It's part of your wholeness. That it's important to you. That it makes sense. And even if it makes sense, it still hurts. It's still confusing. But the sacred that hurts and the sacred that's confusing is different to the simply confusing and hurtful. I think, and if even if it's a purely psychodynamic approach, then the story would be, still about the wholeness of who you are. You just wouldn't use words like sacred. I'm trying to think what that word is. I always think it's appropriation, but it's not. It's like the highest ranking aspect of self-development that you get to, actualization. I think maybe that's what it is. So you'd understand it as part of the logic of the health of who you are, the psychological health of who you are. You don't need to make it a sacred thing. It's just the sacred word makes sense to me. And it can just be purely rational. These are the ways that I operate. These are the things that make sense to me. They're the things that keep me safe, and the things that allow me to see what's going on and to have a clear picture and make a plan and know who I can rely on, and not have to have all of that fluff in the periphery where I'm worrying about it or dreaming about it or stressing about it, even in what I'm not consciously thinking about. but I'm subconsciously wondering, are they telling me the truth? Is this what I'm meant to be doing? Did that person understand what I was saying? All of that energy is illogical. And so you can make it a purely logical prospect to understand what makes sense to you through the process of self-awareness, emergent stories, and asking yourself the self-acceptance question. And it's a continuing process. It doesn't end, kind of ask the questions once or become aware of who you are once and that's it. Because every situation you're in will change who you are. It will change what's relevant. And in every situation, what is relevant will change. If you meditate or go to a concert and get, all that adrenaline and love and happiness and joy and oneness and, spiritual enlightenment into your body, and then you think about the person that you can't forgive or the violence in the world or whatever, you're often able to wash it with some equanimity. So in that moment, there's no fixed set of rules about what's important to you. You're able to, it's not forgive or overlook, but you're able to be magnanimous, I guess, about people's behaviors. You can see them as children and not feel so threatened by what's going on or what appears to be going on or not going on. And so in every moment, you're not really dragging a set of rules with you. In every moment, all the rules are changing depending on how much you've eaten, what you've eaten, who you've had contact, all of those stories that we have about what affects us. But the easiest way to tell that story is if you meditate, you notice it. You notice that it's easier to let things wash over you. If you're happy and you just got a raise or won the lottery, it's easy to let things wash over you. If you've just been to a great concert or speech or show or, rodeo, and you're high on life, it's easy to let things wash over you. So there's no real rigidity in how we respond to the world. So that self-awareness process is also about accepting that those rules that we have not always being applied. We're applying them in a context, and sometimes that context determines whether those rules apply. It's a bit MC Escher, isn't it? But just see how you go. That's probably enough on self-awareness and relationships, reification, REIFICATION. If you're interested in looking it up, I think it's a sociological concept, but it kind of stuck with me. It's one of those words like personhood, just one of those concepts I think that just blew my mind and went, oh, they actually have a word for that. How cool. Schadenfreude. All right, that's enough. I am going to say goodbye for today and not tell you what we're going to talk about next week. You just have to turn up. All right, I love you and I'll speak to you soon.